As the title suggests, we're going to talk about the next Singapore. We are going to ask ourselves whether Kenya has what it takes to be the next Singapore. I'll give you a brief on the country profile, a brief about its history, geography, leadership, education, and then we'll do some reflection. Singapore is a Southeast Asian country with a population of 5.9 million people. It has a GDP of $574 billion and a GDP per capita of 94,000 USD. Curiously, Singapore is the land size of about 744 square kilometers. For comparison, the city of Nairobi is 698 square kilometers. So you have a country the size of Nairobi with a GDP 5 times the size of Kenya. Problem? I think so. Its government is a parliamentary republic. They like to describe themselves as a democracy, but they've been led by one political party since independence. It's called the PAP. This party effectively wins every election with about 90% of a vote. So much so it's become embarrassing to call themselves a democracy with that state. So what they've done recently is they instituted new laws that allow them to donate political seats to the opposition, just so they can claim to be a democracy. That's a slide on the brief history of Singapore. I chose to focus on 4 things. It was founded in 1819. I'm not saying it didn't exist before the British guy found it. It was used by British trading companies to trade with the territories in Southeast Asia, India, and China. Fast forward to 1942 to 1945, the Japanese came and took over the territory, but the Japanese did something unique. When the British were running the show, all the way from administrators to the governor of the territory was British. But when the Japanese came around, they did control the territory, but they let the Singaporeans govern themselves. So World War II comes to an end, and the British come back. They want the old status quo. But the Singaporeans are having none of it. They demand for independence, as is the case of other island territories neighboring Singapore, like Malaysia, Indonesia. So Singapore, knowing it's a small country, economically weak, decides to sit down on the table with Malaysia, form a union that would protect them against people like the British and the Japanese, and allow them to have access to resources which they didn't have, education, small things like water. They didn't have water at the time of getting independence. They did a brief union with Malaysia. But then the Malaysians are like, wait a minute. We are a majority Muslim country. We are generally, typically, of one large ethnic composition. And this group of people are very different from us, and they just make the union complicated. They kicked them out. They were forced to go and do their own independence thing on the side. Their back is against the wall. So they decide to reimagine what independence means. They have this special guy who influences them to think about their freedom and independence in a certain way. We'll talk about it a bit. I think the biggest thing that makes Singapore tick is its geography. Singapore is an island city-state. It's next to Malaysia and Indonesia. And crucially, there is something between Singapore and Indonesia. It's called the Strait of Malacca. Basically, it's a choke point of the ocean. Singapore has a port, the port of Singapore. It's the second biggest port in the world. We'll talk about it some more. So that's the Strait of Malacca. It's a strategic location. Basically, trade that comes from China going to Europe has to pass through there. How much trade do you ask? It's trade worth $5 to $6 trillion. That's 30% of global shipping passing through the shores of Singapore. So what do the Singaporeans do? Basically, they decide to make the entire economy a rent-seeking venture. They will collect rents from everyone who's passing through. We'll talk about how they do it. Okay, so that's a bit more about geography. You can see the areas circled in red are all global shipping choke points. This is where crucial areas that are very tiny and controlled by 1 or 2 countries that you have to have a sort of peaceful working relation with to have your ships pass through. The one on the news currently is the Strait of Hormuz. If you can see Iran, very tiny, somewhere up north. All right, my theory is Singapore's geography is what makes it tick. Allow me to talk about 2 more countries and their geography. Hopefully it'll support my claim. So this is the US. One thing the United States was blessed with is the Mississippi River. What does this river allow them to do? A barge can drag up about 3,000 tons of product. This river is navigable. Everything that is blue is navigable. So theoretically, you can sail on a boat throughout pretty much half the country. Does this make America great? I think you can ask yourself that question. Contrast it to our country, Kenya. For you to transport an equivalent amount of goods, 3,000 tons, you will need about 1,500 trucks. For you to have the 1,500 trucks, you'll need money for the trucks. For you to drive the trucks, you'll need a road for the truck. So think about that entire investment chain. The Americans don't have to do it. They have a river. They just drag things on the river. So is geography a key determinant of success? I'm going to compare it to another country that equally has a gigantic river. This is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo River is the most voluminous river in the world. If we're using the principle of the US, then Congo should be a superpower. No? But crucially, Congo seems to have had a curse of fate, curse of destiny. From the Atlantic Ocean, which is a tiny blue triangle at the bottom corner, all the way to the capital of Kinshasa, the river is not navigable. There exists a series of rapids and waterfalls. There's one called the Inga Cascade, where the DRC people want to build a mega dam that will ostensibly power the entire Africa. I don't know where they'll get the money for that. The next thing that I think is important is the leadership. That's Lee Kuan Yew. He transformed this country from a resource-poor island to what it is today. He promoted industrialization, and education was a key pillar of his politics. One thing he did was emphasize the rule of law and long-term planning, something we seem to lack here. I think some of you were swimming on, was it Friday? He created efficient public service and a political stability that is very welcoming to foreign capital. Capital is very scared. It's a coward. It needs reassurance to come, which he did in droves. But Lee Kuan Yew was a dictator. He wasn't a nice guy. The question is, why is he a different kind of dictator? Which brings me to my next theory. It's not really mine. I read it somewhere and I liked it. It's called the great man theory, or woman, because there's a woman up there. So the great man theory is propagated by some gentleman called Peter Turchin, who claims that for many societies around the world, their growth, their development is shaped by singular figures. The word great does not mean good, please. I know you see Hitler there and think I'm saying Hitler is great. He's not. The great man introduces a new way of thinking, a new culture, a new way of doing things that tend to outlive them. The great man creates institutions. Right? In 2022, there's a gentleman called Daron Acemoglu. He won a Nobel Prize in economics for his theory that for societies to grow, you need strong institutions. He's written a book called Why Nations Fail. I think people like reading that quite a bit. From that image, I have Alexander the Great. He was an inheritor of the Macedonian Empire from his father. He expanded it all over Europe and Asia. Today, the democracy we cherish so much is a derivative of Greek culture. I mean, we call our House of Representatives a Senate, which is a derivative of Greek and Roman culture. Below him is Julius Caesar, that's George Washington, Hitler, Napoleon, Mao, and Queen Victoria. I think if you tie them to their respective countries, you can clearly see a trend in the legacies they left in the countries they ran. Let me talk about this gentleman at the bottom right corner. I think he's the least recognized. His name is Seretse Khama. He's the founding president of Botswana. What is unique about him is, upon independence, Botswana was a mineral-rich country. They had a lot of diamonds. And Seretse Khama, there are many African countries that had a lot of minerals. What's unique about Botswana is he instituted institutions, as they say, which ensured the transfer of wealth from the mining activity to the rest of the populace. Today, Botswana is one of the wealthiest African countries. Even his son got a chance to become president. They do face a new challenge, which is the reliance on diamonds has left them exposed to lab-grown diamonds, but that's a story for another day. I think he's one African leader that would fit into this category of great women and men. The education. So Singapore's education system is a meritocracy. They do something called performance-based advancement. If you're good, you will grow. If you're not, you will not. Contrast that with Kenya, where I mean, you can get your way around if you know someone, or if your parent is someone, or if you have money. They also have a strong state support, and they focus a lot on skills and exam. For you to be a civil servant in Singapore, you have to do a very rigid test. Is that the case in Kenya? Let's do some reflection. These are headlines from Kenyan newspapers. I'm sure you've seen them before. Why do Kenyan and African politicians look at Singapore and tell us that this is what they'll give us? And I don't think, looking at our political class, I don't think they have what it takes. I'm sorry. I guess I'll throw that question to you, the audience, as well.